The emergency room had been loud all night, until it wasn't. One second, a team of doctors was arguing over a chart. The next, every voice dropped because the man on the gurney had stopped moving. No pulse, no breath. Just a body that had given up somewhere between the parking lot and the trauma bay. Then she moved. Not a surgeon, not an attending. The nurse everyone called the paperwork girl. The one who refiled charts nobody asked her to refile and never once raised her hand during rounds. She reached past two doctors and grabbed a surgical instrument nobody in that room had ever seen used outside a combat zone. 18 seconds later, the monitor beeped. And through the emergency entrance, a man in military uniform walked in and said four words that cracked the room wide open. "Where is Evelyn Marsh?" If you're new here, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell, because this is the kind of story this channel was built for. The quiet ones. The overlooked ones. The ones who were written off before anyone bothered to look twice. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled before it's done. Now let's go. She arrived 12 minutes early, same as every other shift, and no one looked up. Evelyn Marsh badged through the east side entrance of Callaway Regional Medical Center at 5:48 in the morning, the one entrance that nobody used because the push bar was stiff, and the overhead light in the corridor behind it had been flickering for 6 weeks, and maintenance kept marking the ticket resolved without actually fixing it. She knew the bar was stiff. She led with her right shoulder. She knew the light would flicker twice before it held, and it did. 3 years of the same entrance, the same flicker, the same walk down the corridor that smelled like floor sealer and the ghost of someone's microwaved lunch, and she had never once mentioned any of it to anyone. Callaway Regional sat in the flat, western edge of Millhaven, Ohio, a city of about 90,000 that existed at the particular American crossroads of having once been something and no longer being sure what. The hospital was a Level 2 trauma center, which meant it handled more than a clinic and less than a major metropolitan ER, and it was perpetually understaffed in the way that Level 2 trauma centers in mid-sized Midwestern cities were perpetually understaffed. Just functional enough to stay open, just short-handed enough that everyone was always doing the job of 1.5 people. Evelyn had been one of those people for 3 years. She was 32, average height, with dark hair she kept clipped back during shifts, and the kind of face that people remembered as calm rather than memorable. Not because anything was wrong with it, but because she had spent a long time practicing the expression of someone who was present without being visible. She wore the same style of scrubs every day in a rotation of navy and gray. No jewelry, no perfume. A badge lanyard that her younger brother had given her 2 winters ago, the kind with a small compass emblem that he'd thought she'd find funny, and she had, though she hadn't told him why. She ate at her workstation when she ate at all, and she had learned to eat one-handed so the other could keep charting. The day shift nursing staff called her various things when she wasn't in earshot. The filer, the shadow, most commonly, because she had a system for everything, and the system worked with an efficiency that annoyed people who hadn't asked for it, the librarian. They didn't mean it viciously, they just meant it the way people mean things about quiet colleagues, as shorthand, as category, as a way of not having to wonder too hard. "Morning, librarian," said Tanya Osei, one of the charge nurses, when Evelyn walked past the central station. Tanya was the kind of nurse who had enough skill and enough seniority to be confident without being careful, and she deployed her nicknames the way other people deployed hellos, casually, without weight. Evelyn pulled her tablet. "Morning. Bay assignments are on the board. Holt wants the chest pain and 4 reassessed before the attending gets in." "Already planned to." She started with the overnight notes. 14 active patients, 2 pending consults, both surgical, one that had been requested at 3 a.m., and still hadn't received a response because the on-call surgical resident was in the middle of an appendectomy and nobody had escalated appropriately. She flagged it to the attending's assistant with a note about time sensitivity, which was the kind of thing she was not technically required to do for a consult that wasn't on her assignment list, but which she did because the alternative was watching a patient sit without an answer for another 2 hours, and she didn't have the patience for that kind of preventable delay. Then she went to Bay 6, where a man named Harold, 68, had been admitted overnight with what the night shift had charted as atypical chest pain, and what the ECG printout told a different story about if you looked at the ST changes across leads 2, 3, and AVF with any attention. She looked. She flagged. She updated the chart with a recommended cardiology consult noted as urgent without saying urgent in the chart, because saying urgent in the chart created administrative problems that slowed things down, and instead used the specific language she had learned triggered faster response from the cardiology fellow. Evolving pattern, recommend prompt correlation. Harold was awake. He was the kind of man who apologized for being a patient, who said sorry when the blood pressure cuff squeezed too hard, who kept trying to sit up straight to make things easier, as though the least he could do in his own medical emergency was be cooperative. "You're not bothering anyone," Evelyn told him, adjusting the lead placement on his chest where one had shifted overnight. "I feel like I am," he said. "There are people worse off." "There are," she said, "and they're being taken care of, so are you." Harold looked at the ceiling for a moment. "My wife is outside. They said only one visitor at a time." "She can come in," Evelyn said. "I'll let the desk know." "Oh, you don't have to. I'm going that direction anyway." She was. She always was. This was the particular efficiency of how she moved through a floor. Never a wasted trip, every action triangulated so that the path between point A and point B passed through as many necessary stops as possible without becoming a performance. She had not learned this as a nurse. She had learned it somewhere else, in a context she no longer allowed herself to think about in any detail, and she had carried it here because it was useful, and because some things, once installed, did not uninstall cleanly. At 7:53, she was restocking Bay 2 when she heard the radio crackle at the ambulance entrance. The EMT communication was garbled. Callaway Regional sat in a shallow geographic valley that made radio transmission unreliable during certain wind conditions, which was a facilities problem that had been on the improvement list for 2 years. But she caught enough. Male patient, approximate age 40 to 50. Found on an access road behind the old industrial corridor, 7 blocks east. Penetrating trauma to the left chest. Blunt force to the head. GCS dropping. ETA 90 seconds. She put down the supply bin. The gurney came through the ambulance bay doors at a controlled run, and what was on it made her stop in a way that she didn't physically stop. Her feet kept moving. But something in the back of her brain, in the part that had been sealed in a box for 3 years, jolted awake with a specificity she wasn't ready for. The patient was male, mid-40s, no identification. The wounds were penetrating, yes, upper left thorax, entry point clean in a way that blunt trauma was not, in a way that spoke of something deliberate, and the skull injury on the right lateral had the pattern of a fall onto a hard surface rather than a strike, which meant whatever had happened to his chest had happened first, and the fall was secondary. His build was military, not gym military, not recreational military, but the particular density of someone who had been maintained as a working tool for a long time. The hands, the shoulders, the way, even unconscious, his body held itself. She noted all of this in the time it took to walk from the hallway to the entrance of Bay 1. The team moved in. Dr. Francis Holt, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Callaway Regional, was called from his office. He arrived in the way he arrived to most things, with the assurance of someone who had been in charge of a space long enough to believe the space existed for him. Holt was 56, silver-haired, and carried the specific professional confidence of a man who had not been wrong about anything, in his own accounting, in at least a decade. He was not a bad doctor. He was a good doctor who had reached the stage of being a good doctor where the goodness had calcified into something that didn't take in new information the way it once had. He was thorough, procedure correct, and almost completely unable to hear a suggestion from someone he hadn't categorized as a peer. Evelyn was not on his list of peers. She was not, in any formal sense, supposed to be in Bay 1. Her assignment was Bay 2 and the overflow floor. She was there anyway, standing at the perimeter, and she was watching the patient's chest. The left side wasn't moving right. It had been subtle when the gurney came in, and it was less subtle now. The asymmetry in chest expansion, the way the trachea at the throat was beginning to deviate rightward by a degree that was easy to miss if you were focused on the blood, which there was, or the skull injury, which was visible and dramatic and drew the eye the way dramatic things always did. She watched Holt order the portable chest x-ray. She watched the travel nurse, someone she didn't know well, 3 months into a contract, go for the imaging equipment. She watched Tanya checking the IV lines. She watched the O2 saturation on the monitor. 92, 90, 87. Dr. Holt, she said. He was reading the EMT handoff. In a minute. His SAT is dropping and his left side isn't moving. I can see the monitor, Marsh. The trachea is deviating. He's tensioning. Holt looked up from the handoff sheet. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the specific patience of someone who had learned to be patient with interruptions from below a certain level of authority. The imaging will tell us what we're dealing with. The imaging will take 4 minutes. He has less than that. The saturation read 84. Marsh. His voice was a boundary. She didn't cross it, not verbally. She went to the supply cabinet on the left wall of Bay 1, the one she had reorganized 8 months ago when she realized the previous configuration put the chest decompression supplies behind the wound packing, which was a sequencing problem in a time-critical scenario. And she took the 14-gauge angiocatheter from the tray where she had placed it, the correct adult length, the one that actually reached through a chest wall on a patient who had real muscle mass rather than the standard issue version that had been stocked before she adjusted the order. She came back to the bedside. Marsh, Holt's voice had dropped an octave. Put that down. His SAT is at 79. The monitor alarm confirmed it, the long ascending tone that meant the number had fallen below the threshold someone had programmed because someone had looked at data and decided that below 79 was the point at which an alarm was warranted, which it was. Though by the time the alarm sounded, in most tension pneumothorax cases, the patient had already passed through the window where simple intervention was possible. The patient's heart rate spiked. 162. Then it dropped. 47. The room did the thing that rooms did in those moments. It held. Evelyn moved. Later, people who had been in Bay 1 would describe it differently depending on what they had been looking at. Tanya said it looked practiced. The travel nurse said it looked like she'd done it before somewhere without any of this equipment. Because she wasn't looking at the supplies, she was looking at the patient. Holt would say, in the departmental review 3 days later, that he had not authorized the procedure and that the outcome did not retroactively authorize it, which was technically accurate and also not the point. She located the second intercostal space by feel, mid-clavicular, the angle her hands found without searching, and she placed the needle with the specificity of someone who understood that the margin for error in this space was not measured in inches. The release was immediate. Trapped air, under pressure, finding the path out. The sound of it was small and would have been easy to miss if you weren't listening for it, but she was. And it was the sound she had been listening for since the gurney came through the door. The saturation climbed. 79, 84, 89, 93. The heart rate came back, steady. Not great, but present and regular. The room exhaled. Holt was standing 18 inches from her. His hands were at his sides. Something was happening in his face that she didn't examine closely because examining it would require her to have a response to it, and she was focused on next steps. Chest tube tray, she said to Tanya. Call thoracic surgery. The attending, not the resident. Tanya moved without hesitating, which told Evelyn something about Tanya that she filed away. Marsh. Holt's voice was controlled now in the way that things were controlled when the control was the point. You will explain to me how you knew to do that. I'll explain after the chest tube is placed, she said. He still needs definitive management. I will make that determination. You will, she said. But the tube tray is coming and thoracic is being called and the patient is currently stable. And if you want to undo any of that, that is your authority. He didn't undo it. Thoracic surgery arrived in the form of Dr. Augustine Parrish, who was 51 and had seen enough in his career that he walked into rooms and assessed them the way experienced people assessed rooms, by reading the residue of what had happened rather than what people told him happened. He looked at the patient, he looked at the needle placement, he looked at Evelyn. Who did the decompression? He said. Bay 2, said Tanya. Parrish looked at Evelyn for a second longer than was necessary. He placed the chest tube without comment and transferred the patient to the ICU with orders that filled 2 pages and the particular efficiency of someone who understood that efficiency in this moment was the difference between the patient leaving the hospital in a body bag or walking out in 6 days. Evelyn went to Bay 2. She updated the chart on Harold, whose wife had come in and was holding his hand and watching the cardiac monitor with the focused attention of someone who had learned in the past 12 hours more about ECG readings than she'd ever wanted to know. She checked in on the overflow patients. She caught a transcription error on a discharge summary that would have sent a patient home with the wrong antibiotic dose and quietly corrected it through the pharmacy channel without making it a scene. At 12:40, Francis Holt called her into his office. It was a small room that had the feeling of every administrative office in every hospital she had ever been in. Paperwork asserting itself over available space, a desk too large for what the desk was actually used for, a chair positioned to remind visitors that the desk was the important thing. Holt sat behind it. He had a folder in front of him that she understood to be either already written or waiting to be signed, and the expression on his face was the one she had seen before. Not from him specifically, but from the category of person he belonged to, the expression of someone who had decided the verdict and was now conducting the trial. "You performed an unauthorized invasive procedure," he said. "You used hospital supplies without a physician's order. You bypassed attending authority in an active trauma situation. I am suspending your clinical privileges pending a formal departmental review." She looked at him. He would have died. "That is not a determination you are qualified to make." "He would have died," she said again. Not louder, just again. "And you know that." Holt's jaw moved. "What I know is that a nurse with no documented training in emergency thoracic procedures performed a needle decompression on an unidentified trauma patient, and that this hospital now has a legal exposure." "Where did you see the training record?" she said. He paused. "What?" "You said no documented training. You reviewed my file?" "Your personnel file shows standard nursing credentials, RN licensure, ICU rotation, 3 years of ED floor work. Nothing that—" "Then you reviewed an incomplete file," she said. "It came out flat, not as an accusation, just as a statement about the state of a document." He looked at her for a moment. "What does that mean?" She didn't answer that. "Your badge," he said. She unclipped it, set it on the desk. She kept the lanyard because it was hers. "The review takes 3 to 5 business days. You are not to enter any clinical area." She nodded. She stood. She left. The hallway outside Holt's office was one of the quiet ones. A back corridor near the East Wing supply rooms where the foot traffic was light and the overhead lights had the slightly yellow quality of a space that maintenance had not prioritized. She stood with her back against the wall. Not because she was crumbling, because she needed 45 seconds to recalibrate, to re-identify which way was level now that the ground had shifted again, which it always did, eventually, and she had long since stopped being surprised by it. She had known what she was trading. In the moment beside the gurney, with the needle in her hand and Holt's voice behind her ordering her to stop, she had known. It had not changed the answer. The answer was what it had always been. In the places and circumstances she did not allow herself to think about. You do not let the patient die because doing the right thing costs you something. You do the right thing. You pay the cost. The costs added up. That was the math. She walked out of the back corridor, past the nurse's station, past Bay 7 where a teenager with a broken wrist was telling his mother it didn't really hurt that bad and his face said otherwise. And she pushed through the door to the ambulance bay because the ambulance bay was the one place outside the clinical areas where you could stand without anyone needing something from you. The bay was empty. Mid-afternoon, mid-week, one of those pauses that felt like quiet but wasn't, the kind that lasted exactly long enough to make you believe in it before it ended. She stood in the cool, exhaust-scented air and looked at the access road that curved around the south side of the building, the one that connected eventually to the industrial corridor, the stretch of Millhaven that had been declining for 15 years and was now mostly repurposed warehouses and the occasional food distribution company. The stretch where someone had left a man to die that morning in a way that was careful enough to look accidental to anyone who wasn't looking at it the way she'd looked at it. She was still looking at it, in her head, at the wound placement, at the deliberateness. When she heard the vehicles, she heard them before she saw them. The engine weight was different from ambulances, different from city vehicles. She had spent enough time near government transport to identify the sound without seeing the source, the overdressed suspension, the discipline of the convoy spacing, 3 vehicles moving in a line around the corner of the access road with the kind of coordination that was not an accident, 2 dark SUVs with federal plates, 1 vehicle that could have passed for a fleet rental if you didn't notice the antenna configuration on the roof and the specific window tint that wasn't cosmetic. They stopped in a neat line at the edge of the ambulance bay. The doors opened. A man got out first. Mid-40s. Uniform that was not the dress kind. The working kind. Worn without ceremony because it was just what he wore. The rank insignia was the kind she recognized. The kind that didn't require the person wearing it to remind anyone that it mattered. I was lean in the way that people were lean who had been running on bad sleep for years without complaining about it. He took in the ambulance bay, the service entrance, and then her, in a single unhurried sweep that she recognized as a trained assessment rather than a look. Behind him, two individuals in civilian clothes that didn't conceal what they were. The uniformed man looked at her badge clip, empty, then at her face. "This is Callaway Regional," he said. "Yes." "I'm Colonel Darius Vance," he said. "Army Medical Special Operations." He said it without inflection, the way people stated facts they expected to be believed. "We're looking for a nurse named Evelyn Marsh." The afternoon sat between them. She had spent 3 years building a version of herself that fit inside the dimensions of this hospital. Small, functional, unremarkable, safe. She had been methodical about it. She had believed, thorough. And standing in the diesel-scented air of the ambulance bay with a man in a working uniform saying her full name, like he'd been carrying it a long distance, she felt 3 years of careful construction develop a fracture line straight down the center. "That's me," she said. Vance looked at her for a half-second longer than the confirmation required. Then, "The man you stabilized this morning. The unidentified patient." A pause that had weight in it. "His name is Warren Solis. He was an Army intelligence operative who went dark 22 months ago. The people who put him on that access road know he survived." Inside the hospital, somewhere behind the steel door, a monitor alarm began to sound. The alarm was the kind that the ICU used for cardiac events. A sustained two-tone pulse that carried through the steel door with enough volume to reach the ambulance bay. And it lasted 11 seconds before it stopped, which meant someone had gotten there fast enough, which meant Warren Solis was still alive, which was the only thing that mattered right now. Evelyn looked at the door, then at Vance. "How long has he been missing?" she said. 22 months. Vance wasn't reading from anything. He had the information the way people had information they'd been living with. "He went dark after his last contact with our division. We'd been running a passive search, nothing that would surface in civilian channels, until this morning, when his biometrics came back on a hospital intake. He didn't have ID on him. He has a subcutaneous tag, left forearm, below the elbow, the kind that doesn't show on standard intake scans unless you're running the federal frequency." Vance paused. "Your intake system doesn't run it. Ours picked it up when your hospital pushed the intake record to the state database at 9:47 this morning. That was approximately 2 hours after Warren Solis had been brought in, which meant from the moment the intake record went into the state system, the clock had been running on how long it would take whoever had put him on that access road to find out he hadn't died." "You said they know he survived," she said. "We believe so, yes." "How?" "The same way we found him," Vance said. "Someone else is monitoring that database." He said it without drama, which made it worse. "We have approximately 4 hours before we can move him to a secure facility. The transfer requires a medical clearance that his current condition may not support, and we need him conscious for intake processing before he can be moved." She looked at him directly. "He's in a medically induced state right now, post-trauma, post-procedure. Waking him on a timeline isn't—" "I know." "Then why are you telling me?" He held her look. "Because Dr. Parrish says the person who would know whether there's a faster path to stabilization is the nurse who already saved his life once today." Evelyn stood in the ambulance bay and felt the particular weight of a decision that had already been made presenting itself as a choice. "I've been suspended," she said. "I know that too." She looked at the door again, then she pushed it open. The ICU was on the 3rd floor, which required the elevator or the east stairwell, and she took the stairwell because the elevator in the east wing moved slowly, and she was already calculating minutes. Vance followed her without being asked and without asking, which told her something about how he operated. One of the civilian-dressed individuals from the second SUV came inside as well, and positioned himself near the stairwell door in a way that was not aggressive, but was not ambiguous either. The ICU charge nurse was a woman named Britta Sold, who had been at Callaway Regional longer than almost anyone, and had the manner of someone who had seen everything twice and was not impressed by most of it. She saw Evelyn come through the ICU doors without a badge and opened her mouth. Colonel Vance, Evelyn said, stepping aside, and Vance showed Britta something in a credential folder that Britta looked at for 4 full seconds before she nodded and stepped back. Evelyn went to Warren Solis's bay. He looked worse under a proper light than he had in the trauma bay, which was usually true. The ICU had the particular honesty of good overhead lighting and monitoring equipment that reported everything. He was intubated. The chest tube was draining correctly, the output color and volume in the range she expected. The skull injury had been CT'd, and the result was on the screen at the bedside. No significant intracranial hemorrhage, which was the best news the morning had produced. He had a fractured rib, fourth, left, and soft tissue damage consistent with the mechanism. He was alive because of a margin that, an hour earlier, had been down to seconds. She looked at the sedation drip. She looked at his vitals. She looked at the chart Parrish had left, which was thorough in the way Parrish's charts were thorough, the documentation of a man who understood that his charts were his argument. Current sedation level keeps him under for another 3 to 4 hours, she said to Vance, who was standing at the edge of the bay. If I taper the protocol under attending supervision, not my call alone, I'd need Parrish. He could be at a coherent level in 90 minutes, maybe less, but coherent doesn't mean capable of what you need. If he has any post-trauma confusion, or if there's a bleed the CT missed, pushing him up too fast. What do you recommend? Vance said. I recommend letting him wake on his own timeline. We don't have his timeline. Then I'd say get me Parrish and let us look at the secondary blood work together. She said it without inflection. The man survived whatever they did to him and survived the procedure this morning. Rushing the recovery because someone is watching a database is exactly the kind of mistake that ends with him in worse shape than when he came in. Vance looked at her for a moment. She had the sense, not for the first time, that he was recalibrating something. Dr. Parrish is on the way up, he said. Good. She went back to the vitals and started building the picture she'd need when Parrish arrived. It was during those 12 minutes, while she worked and Vance stood in the bay and the civilian agent stood at the ICU entrance, and Britta Sold moved through her rounds with the careful deliberateness of someone pretending this was a normal afternoon, that Francis Holt arrived. She heard him before she saw him. The voice in the corridor directed at Britta, using the particular register he used when he wanted to establish that he was the authority in the room before he had even entered it. Why are there federal agents on my ICU floor? Britta said something she couldn't catch. I don't care what credentials they showed you. This is my hospital, and I need to know. He came through the bay entrance and stopped. The stop was almost physical, like a man walking into a door that he'd expected to be open. He saw Evelyn at the bedside. He saw Vance. He looked between them, and his face went through several things in rapid succession, none of them good. Marsh, he said, you were suspended from clinical duties. She's here at my request, Vance said, before Evelyn could speak. Colonel? Holt read the rank insignia with the quick literacy of someone who had learned to read it. I don't know what your jurisdiction covers, but inside Callaway Regional, clinical decisions are made by the attending staff. A suspended nurse does not have access to patient care areas. The patient in this bay is a federal intelligence asset, Vance said. He said it with the same even tone he used for everything, which was more effective than if he had raised his voice. His care falls under a federal medical authority umbrella while he remains at risk. Nurse Marsh's presence was requested by the supervising physician. Dr. Parrish approved it on his way up, Vance said. You can confirm when he arrives. He's 3 minutes out. Holt looked at Evelyn. The look had something in it she recognized. Not anger exactly, or not only anger, but the specific discomfort of a person whose version of events was getting complicated by facts they hadn't expected. This conversation isn't finished, he said. I know, she said. She kept her eyes on the monitor. He left. Parrish arrived at the 7-minute mark, not 3, because the elevator had been slow, and he walked into the bay with the folder from the secondary labs and the expression of someone who had spent the past hour being briefed on something he hadn't been briefed on before and was still processing it. His troponin is elevated but not critical, Parrish said, by way of greeting. The echo from this morning shows a contusion to the left ventricular wall, which I don't love, but it's not the crisis the initial picture suggested. He looked at the sedation monitor. You're thinking about tapering. I'm thinking about whether it's viable, she said, not whether it's advisable. Difference being, Viable means his cardiac picture supports the hemodynamic shift. Advisable is a different conversation involving people in this room who aren't either of us. Parrish looked at Vance, then back at the chart. If we drop the propofol by 40% and hold the fentanyl at current rate, he could start surfacing in 70 minutes. Maybe 60 if his metabolism runs fast. He paused. But if there's any underlying instability the CT didn't catch, bringing him up too fast could— I know, Vance said. Then you understand I can't authorize this as a clean yes, Parrish said. What I can do is monitor him at 10-minute intervals and make the call in real time. If his pressure or his cardiac rhythm does anything I don't like, we stop and he goes back under. Vance looked at Evelyn. She looked at Warren Solis, at the steadiness of the waveform on the cardiac monitor, at the chest tube output, at the 11 things she could read from the bedside equipment that the chart didn't quite capture. Do it, she said. Parrish adjusted the drip. The next 58 minutes were the kind that moved in two different speeds simultaneously, objectively slow. Small incremental changes, a number shifting a decimal point, a respiratory pattern changing its rhythm by fractions, and subjectively fast because each increment was a commitment that couldn't be undone quickly. And the window between stable and unstable in a patient with a ventricular contusion was narrower than most people wanted to believe. Evelyn sat at the bedside and did what she did well, which was watch without looking like she was watching. She updated the nursing notes in the chart because someone had to, and Britta was managing 4 other patients. She noted the timestamps. She noted the sequence of changes in a way that would be legible to anyone reviewing the chart later, which was a habit she had never fully explained to anyone at Callaway Regional, and which came from the understanding, installed a long time ago, that records were the difference between accountability and erasure. At the 40-minute mark, Solis's blood pressure dipped. Not catastrophically, a drop of 11 points systolic, but enough that Parrish looked at her over the bed and she shook her head slightly because her read of the waveform was that it was a positional artifact, and Parrish held, and the pressure came back up in 90 seconds. At 53 minutes, Warren Solis moved his left hand. It was a small movement, the fingers curling and releasing, the kind that happened at the early edge of emergence from sedation when the brain was starting to reassert itself before the rest of the body caught up. But it was purposeful, not a reflex. A person. Parrish leaned in. Mr. Solis, can you hear me? Nothing for 30 seconds. Then the eyes moved behind the lids. Mr. Solis, you're in a hospital. You're safe. Can you squeeze my hand? A long pause. Then a squeeze. Weak, imprecise, but real. Vance moved to the bedside from the corner of the bay where he'd been standing for the past hour. He hadn't sat down the entire time. Evelyn had noticed. It was the particular stand of someone who had learned to be ready to move at a moment's notice and couldn't fully turn that off even when there was nothing to move toward. The extubation took another 20 minutes, managed by Parrish with the careful efficiency of someone for whom this was a procedure and not an occasion. Warren Solis breathed on his own. His eyes opened, gray, bloodshot at the sclera from the trauma, focusing slowly on the ceiling above the bed with the deliberate effort of someone trying to assemble something out of fragments. Hey, Evelyn said, low, not clinical. Take a breath. You don't have to do anything yet. His eyes found her. He looked at her for several seconds without speaking, and in the look was something she couldn't immediately categorize. Not the blank confusion of post-sedation, not gratitude, not fear. Recognition of a kind that didn't make sense, because she had never met Warren Solis before this morning. His voice, when it came, was wrecked from the intubation tube and came out barely above a rasp. Medic, he said. Not a question. She looked at him. Not anymore. His jaw worked. He was fighting the sedation residue, fighting the effort of being conscious after what his body had been through. Vance, he said. I'm here, Vance said, stepping forward. They know. A pause, a breath that cost him something. Not just about me. The whole thing. Another pause. Tanner. Vance's expression didn't change, which was its own change. The specific stillness of someone receiving information that changes the shape of a situation. Tanner is compromised? Solis closed his eyes, opened them again with visible effort. Tanner is the source. He stopped. His pressure on the monitor bumped. Parrish put a hand on his shoulder. Not restraint, orientation. He's been running it since Keene Valley. Everything that happened to the unit. His eyes went to Evelyn again, the same look. Everything that happened to her. The bay went quiet. Evelyn sat with that sentence. She felt it arrive the way you felt something land when you'd been bracing for impact for so long that the actual impact was almost a relief and almost unbearable in equal measure. She didn't ask what he meant. She knew what he meant. She had known for 3 years in the sealed storage unit at the back of her memory. In the box she didn't open. The rough shape of what had happened. She had just never had a name for the interior of it. "Who is Tanner?" she said. She said it to Vance. Vance looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Regional director of a private defense subcontractor called Palliser Group. He had oversight of the contract your unit was operating under in Keene Valley. "The mission that went wrong," she said. "Yes." "I was told the investigation concluded it was a field error," she said. "My field error." "I know what you were told." She looked at him. "You knew it wasn't." "My division has suspected Tanner's involvement for 14 months, Vance said. "We didn't have evidence that would hold up in a federal proceeding. Solis was gathering that evidence when he disappeared." He stopped. "When they made him disappear." The monitor beeped. Parrish checked it, adjusted something, watched the readout for a moment. "How close was he?" she said. "Close enough that they put him on an access road this morning," Vance said. "The evidence he compiled." He glanced at Solis, who had drifted back under the pull of the sedation residue and was no longer fully tracking. "We don't know where it is. He was the only carrier, and until he's stable enough to tell us, you're sitting on a 4-hour window with people monitoring the database," she said. "Yes." She stood up from the chair beside the bed. Her back ached in the way that backs ached when you'd been holding tension in your shoulders for 8 straight hours without acknowledging it. She walked to the window of the ICU bay. It looked out on the east side of the building, the surface parking, and beyond it, the low, flat grid of Millhaven's industrial corridor, the stretch of access road where a man had been left to die that morning. She was thinking about Keene Valley, about the mission brief she had received and the way it had not matched the conditions on the ground, about the soldiers she had stabilized in a collapsed structure under fire that shouldn't have had fire in it, because the intelligence said the sector was clear, and the intelligence had been wrong in the specific and calibrated way that intelligence is wrong when someone has deliberately altered it. About the inquiry that followed, which she had not been permitted to attend in full, and the determination that arrived in a formal letter, and the way the letter had been worded to make her responsible for decisions that had been made above her by people she had trusted. 3 years ago. 3 years of a side entrance with a stiff push bar and a lanyard with a compass clip and a hospital that called her the librarian. She turned from the window. Tanya Osei was standing in the ICU bay doorway. She had a look on her face that was somewhere between uncertain and urgent, and she was looking at Evelyn rather than at Vance, which meant whatever had brought her up here was about Evelyn specifically. "What?" Evelyn said. "Holt called an emergency board meeting," Tanya said. "For this afternoon." She paused. "He's not just pushing the suspension. He's filing for permanent revocation." The words landed without particular drama. Evelyn heard them, processed them, and felt, in the layered way she felt most things, 2 separate responses occupying the same space. The part of her that understood this was the institutional machinery doing what institutional machinery did when it felt threatened, and the part of her that was 32 years old and standing in an ICU bay beside a man whose life she had saved twice in one day, and whose survival had just told her that her own had been stolen by a deliberate act, and who was now about to lose her license for the procedure that proved it. She looked at Vance. He was already looking at her. "The board meeting," he said. "When?" 4 o'clock, Tanya said. It was 2:17. Vance pulled out his phone. He made a call and spoke 4 sentences into it and listened for 2 and hung up. He looked at Evelyn. "My legal division is contacting hospital administration in," he checked his watch, "approximately 8 minutes. The Federal Medical Authority designation I referenced with your chief covers this patient's primary care team. That designation can be formally invoked to suspend any adverse employment actions against personnel during an active federal operation." He paused. "It's not a permanent solution. It's a pause." "A pause," she said, "until this is finished." She looked at him. "And when is this finished?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. The honest one. The one that didn't promise a clean ending because clean endings were not the architecture of the situations she had been in before, in the places she was not supposed to be thinking about. When we have what Solis came here to give us, he said, and when the people who put him on that road can't touch anyone else. She looked at Warren Solis, breathing steadily under the hum of the monitors, alive by margins that shouldn't have held. She was about to say something when the civilian agent at the ICU entrance stepped into the bay and spoke 2 words to Vance with the specific velocity of someone delivering information that changes the room. "We have movement." Vance turned. "Where?" "East parking lot. 2 vehicles, no plates. They've been stationary for 11 minutes. The agent's eyes moved to the window behind Evelyn, the one that looked out over the east side, the surface parking, the low grid of the industrial corridor. "They're not EMTs and they're not visitors." Evelyn turned back to the window. The 2 vehicles were there, a gray panel van and a dark sedan, parked in the outer row of the lot at angles that gave clear sightlines to the east entrance, the ambulance bay, and the external stairwell that led to the ICU floor. She had used that entrance this morning, 12 minutes early, badge swipe and a shoulder push. She looked at the vehicles for a long moment. Then she looked at Solis, still and vulnerable and the only person alive who could finish what he'd started. Then at the ICU bay, with its single exit and its one window, and the distance between where they were standing and anywhere that was more defensible. She looked at Vance. "You need to move him," she said. "Right now, not in 4 hours." Vance was already on the phone. Outside in the parking lot, neither vehicle had moved, but the sedan's brake lights came on once, not to leave, just briefly, like a signal, and then went dark again. The brake lights went dark and stayed dark, which was worse than if they'd moved. A vehicle that moved was a vehicle making a decision. A vehicle that stayed still after signaling was a vehicle that had already made one. Vance was on the phone, voice low and clipped, using the particular shorthand of someone who had pre-established communication protocols and was now running them. Evelyn heard fragments. East lot, 2 vehicles, no plates, possible surveillance posture, need eyes on the stairwell exits. She didn't wait for the call to finish. She went to Britta Sold at the ICU station. "I need to know who has access to this floor right now," she said. "Not credential access, physical access. Who is on this floor, in the last 40 minutes, who wasn't here before noon?" Britta looked at her with the flat assessment of someone who had been in critical care nursing long enough to know when a question had weight behind it. There was a facilities guy in the server room at the end of the hall. He came up at 1:50. "You see his badge?" "I saw a badge. I didn't check it against the board." "Where is he now?" Britta looked at the hallway, then back at Evelyn. "I don't know." Evelyn turned to the agent at the ICU entrance, a man whose name she still didn't have. "Server room, end of the hall. Check it." He looked at Vance, who had just come off the call, and Vance gave a nod so small it barely qualified as movement, and the agent went. "We have 12 minutes before the second team arrives to supplement," Vance said, coming to stand beside her at the station. "I've requested a medical transport, armored, with an EMT on board, to move Solis. But the clearance window for an unscheduled patient transfer through the hospital's system requires a physician authorization, which Parrish will sign it," she said. "He needs to understand what he's signing." "He'll understand." She was already moving back toward the bay. "Parrish isn't afraid of paperwork. He's afraid of patients dying. Tell him the patient dies if he stays on this floor, and Parrish will sign whatever you put in front of him." She was right, and it took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of Parrish reading the transport authorization with the focused attention of a man who understood that his signature was an argument he'd have to make in a peer review committee at some point, and the argument had to hold, and then signing it because his read of the situation matched hers, and the patient's cardiac picture had stabilized enough to support movement with proper monitoring. The agent came back from the end of the hall. "Server room is empty," he said, "but the maintenance panel on the north wall was accessed. The latch is open. It wasn't forced." Vance looked at Evelyn. "What's behind that panel?" she said. "The hospital's internal communication routing," Britta said from the station. She had followed the conversation with the quiet attention of someone who had decided to be useful. "The intercom lines, the nurse call system, the paging network. If someone accessed the routing, they can hear what's said over the internal system," Evelyn said. "And suppress it," Britta said. or redirect it. I had a page that didn't go through about 40 minutes ago. I assumed it was the system. It does that. 40 minutes ago was approximately when the two vehicles appeared in the east lot. Evelyn looked at Vance. He was already back on the phone. She went back to Solis. I was more alert than he'd been 20 minutes ago. The sedation residue was burning off faster than Parrish had projected, which was either a good sign about his metabolism or a concerning sign about how much adrenaline his system was running on. His eyes tracked her when she came to the bedside. "We're moving you," she said. "Armored transport. You don't need to do anything except let us move you." "The files," he said. His voice was still wrecked, but the clarity behind it had sharpened. "I had files before they—" "We'll get to that." "No." He tried to shift and she put a hand on his shoulder. Not gentle, just firm enough to communicate that moving was not what was happening. "You don't understand. The files aren't in a system. They're not digital." He stopped, made the effort to regulate his breathing the way people regulated breathing when they were in pain and trying to think past it. "I encoded them. Physical medium. It's here." She looked at him. "In the hospital." "I didn't come in on that access road by accident," he said. "I came that way because I was trying to reach this hospital specifically. I had a contact here. Someone I trusted to hold something if I couldn't make it further." The room reconfigured in her mind. Not a victim found by chance. A man who had made a decision about where to go and had nearly not made it there. "Who?" she said. He looked at her. The look was the same one from when he'd first opened his eyes. That recognition she hadn't been able to categorize. "You don't know what you were to that unit," he said. It came out sideways, not as an answer to her question, but as something he'd been carrying toward this moment. "The soldiers you pulled out, what they said about you after." He stopped. "I was an intelligence officer. I read the debriefs." "Who was your contact?" she said again. He held her look for another second. "A nurse. On this floor. Name was Gil Marin." She went very still. Gil Marin was a night shift ICU nurse who had been at Callaway Regional for 4 years. She knew him the way she knew most of the staff she didn't work alongside directly. By reputation, by the notes he left in charts, by the 3 times they'd crossed paths during shift transitions. He was good, meticulous, quiet in a way she recognized because she practiced it herself. He had called in sick that morning. She had seen it on the board when she came in. Night shift transition, Gil Marin out sick, coverage pulled from the float pool. She said it out loud without meaning to. "He called in sick today." Solis's face changed. The thing that moved across it was not surprise. "How long has he been at this hospital?" Vance said from behind her. He had come into the bay without her hearing him, which was a measure of how focused she'd been. 4 years, she said, and he called in this morning, the same morning Solis appeared on that access road. The math assembled itself without requiring any additional work. She looked at Solis. "The physical medium. He was holding it for you. Do you know where?" He would have put it somewhere in the hospital, somewhere deniable, a place that looked like it belonged. He was fading slightly at the edges. The effort of the conversation was costing him, and the cost was visible in his pressure on the monitor, which had bumped 4 points in the past 90 seconds. "We had a protocol. If I came in injured, if I couldn't communicate directly, he'd move it to the secondary location." "Which is?" "I don't know the secondary," he said. "That was the point. If they got to me, I couldn't give up what I didn't know." She straightened up. Her back still ached. She was running on the particular fuel that was not quite adrenaline and not quite anger, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. The fuel that she'd learned to manage in conditions where managing it was the difference between functional and not. "We need to find Gil Marin," she said to Vance. "My team is already—" From the ICU entrance, Britta Sold said, "Evelyn." The tone was the one that nurses used when something was happening that required immediate attention but couldn't be yelled about. Evelyn came out of the bay. The agent was at the main ICU doors, which had a small reinforced window in each panel. I was looking through one of them without touching it. "Stairwell," he said. She looked through the other window. The east stairwell had a glass panel in its door, visible from the ICU entrance at an angle. Through it, through the vertical rectangle of reinforced glass, she could see a portion of the landing, a shadow that was not moving but had the shape and density of a person standing still, waiting, in the particular way that people waited when they were not waiting for anything that had been announced. One person visible, which meant at least one more she couldn't see. Vance came up beside her. He looked through the window. His expression didn't change, which she had come to understand was not blankness, but the result of a long career in situations where the face going readable was a liability. "The elevator," she said quietly. "Controlled by the same routing panel they access downstairs," he said, "so they can hold it. Or call it." She looked at the ICU floor, 12 patients, monitors, IV poles. The particular vulnerability of a floor where everyone in a bed was already at their physical limit. "The transport," she said, 7 minutes out. "The south exit." "Clear as of 4 minutes ago," the agent said, "but 4 minutes is 4 minutes." She thought about it. Not long, she didn't have long, and the kind of thinking required here was not the kind that benefited from extended consideration. It was the kind that required you to have already done the thinking in some other time and place, so that when the moment arrived, the answer was available. She had done this kind of thinking before, in places she didn't talk about, with worse information and worse odds and equipment that was held together in ways that would have failed every hospital certification standard. "We move him through the south corridor," she said. "Not the stairwell, not the elevator. There's a service corridor that connects this floor to the west wing. It's used for equipment transport. It's not on the standard floor plan that a facilities badge would pull up, and it comes out near the loading dock on the south side." She paused. "The transport can come to the loading dock." Vance looked at her. "How do you know about that corridor?" "I reorganized the ICU supply cabinet 8 months ago. The equipment carts come up through that route. I walked it 3 times. She said it without making it a thing. It was just information she had, the way she had information about the push bar on the east entrance and the flicker pattern of the lights, and the specific dosing error pattern of one particular attending, because she paid attention, and attention accumulated. "Can we move him through it safely?" Parrish said. He had come out of the bay, and she hadn't heard that either. She was going to have to recalibrate her situational awareness, because this floor was making her too focused inward. "His pressure is holding," she said. "The chest tube is portable. We put him on the transport monitor, wheel him through, and we have 7 minutes before the second team arrives. It's tight, but it works if we start now." "Then we start now," Parrish said. It was not smooth. It was the opposite of smooth, which was fine, because smooth was a thing that happened in ideal conditions, and ideal conditions did not exist. Solis was moved from the ICU bed to the transport gurney with the efficiency of people who were working against a clock and knew it. Parrish managing the chest tube and the IV lines, Evelyn managing the monitor leads and the airway, because Solis was no longer intubated, but his airway was not something she was willing to treat as an afterthought. Britta Soul doing the thing that great ICU nurses did in chaotic situations, which was to be exactly where the next thing needed to happen before anyone said it needed to happen. The agent held the bay door. Vance was on comms, tracking the stairwell, tracking the parking lot, tracking the transport vehicle's position in 2-minute intervals. They were in the service corridor, a space that was exactly what it sounded like, fluorescent lit and utilitarian and smelling of rubber wheels and industrial lubricant, wide enough for the equipment carts that used it, and not much else. When the main ICU doors opened, she heard it, the pressure change and the sound of the latch. Vance heard it too. He put a hand up, not a dramatic gesture, just a flat palm at waist height, the universal signal for stop and be still. And they stopped. And in the service corridor, the only sounds were the wheels of the gurney and the soft beeping of the portable monitor and the HVAC system moving air through a duct somewhere above them. Then footsteps. Not hurrying. Measured. Someone who was not alarmed because they were doing the alarming. "How many?" she said, almost no voice at all. "Unknown," the agent said, "same register. The stairwell count was 2 minimum." The service corridor had 1 entry point from the ICU floor and 1 exit point to the west wing. They were equidistant between the two. Going back meant going toward whatever had come through the ICU doors. Going forward was the only direction. "Move," Vance said. They moved. The gurney wheels were not quiet. Nothing about a gurney in a hard-floored corridor was quiet. But quiet was no longer the objective. Speed was. Parrish was not a man built for physical urgency in a corridor, but he moved, keeping pace, keeping his hands on the chest tube, because the chest tube displaced was a potentially fatal event, and he was not going to let that happen. Britta had the IV bag. Evelyn had the monitor watching the readout in her peripheral while the rest of her attention was on the space ahead. The West Wing exit was a door with a push bar, different from the East entrance, newer, better maintained. The agent went through it first, held it, and then they were out of the service corridor and into the West Wing's lower delivery level, which was significantly less populated than the ICU floor but not empty. A dietary aide pushing a cart looked at them with the expression of someone deciding whether what they were seeing was routine or not. "Medical transfer," Evelyn said to her, not slowing. "It's fine." The aide nodded, which was either belief or the reasonable decision not to ask. The loading dock was 50 feet further, through a set of double doors that opened onto the building's south-facing exterior. The armored transport was there. Not an ambulance, something heavier, with a modified rear compartment and an EMT in the back, who came down the ramp the moment the doors opened, taking in the patient's condition with the professional speed read that good transport medics developed. "Chest tube?" he said. "Left side, fourth intercostal, draining clear," Evelyn said, already moving to the gurney head. "Cardiac contusion currently stable. BP was running 118/74 as of 3 minutes ago. He's off sedation for about 40 minutes. GCS is..." She checked Solis, who was awake and tracking but not speaking. "GCS 14. Airway is clear and self-managed." The EMT took it in and nodded. "We got it from here." She stood back. Parrish stepped back. Solis was loaded. The ramp went up. The doors closed with the solid, heavy sound of something designed to be both transport and barrier. And the vehicle moved out of the loading dock and went south, away from the parking lot and the two vehicles with no plates and the brake light that had flashed once and gone dark. Evelyn stood on the loading dock in the cold afternoon air and breathed. The breathing was not dramatic. It was functional. The deliberate kind. The kind she used to reset the physiological state that sustained operational urgency, because operational urgency used up resources faster than it felt like it did. And if she didn't reset, she'd be running on fumes in an hour. She heard the ICU alarm from somewhere above and inside the building. Not a cardiac alarm. The nurse call system. The one that routed through the panel that had been accessed. It was running at high frequency, all channels at once, which meant someone had triggered a system-wide alert either to mask movement sounds or to create a response that would pull staff in a specific direction. She looked at Vance. "They're running a diversion," she said. "Yes." "Which means they know we moved him." "Or they expected we would," he said. "There's a difference." The difference was that one meant they were reacting, and one meant they had planned for this contingency. And a contingency plan required resources in multiple positions, and multiple positions meant that the two vehicles in the east lot were not the whole picture. Her phone vibrated. She didn't have her phone. She'd left it in the break room locker when she came off shift, which she did automatically because personal phones in clinical areas were a protocol she followed even when she was angry about other protocols not being followed. The vibration was Vance's, and he looked at it and his face did the thing it did. "My team just located Gil Marin," he said. She waited. "He's at his apartment. He's not answering the door, but the neighbor saw him come in this morning and hasn't seen him leave." Pause. "There are signs of entry on the apartment below his. Someone came in through the lower unit and could have accessed the floor above." Gil Marin had called in sick this morning at 6:14 before she'd arrived, before the intake record had pushed to the state database, before anyone except the people who'd put Solis on that access road would have known Solis was at Callaway Regional, which meant they'd gotten to Gil Marin before they knew Solis had survived, which meant Gil Marin had been flagged not as a hospital employee, but as Solis's contact specifically, and they'd moved on him preemptively to cut the information chain before it could activate. "Is he alive?" she said. Vance looked at his phone. "Unknown." She looked at the south road the transport had taken, already out of sight. Then at the hospital building, the nurse call system still audible through the walls in its abnormal all-channel pattern. Then at the service entrance through which they'd come. "The secondary location," she said. "If Gil moved whatever Solis had to a secondary location before they got to him, it's somewhere in this hospital, because he couldn't have moved it out without being seen. He called in sick, which means he was already compromised or he knew he was about to be, and he came here to hide it before he went home." "You're saying he came in," Vance said. "I'm saying he called in sick at 6:14 and the hospital's badge access log will tell us whether he actually came in this morning before his call." She looked at Vance. "Can you pull that?" Vance was already on the phone. The badge log pulled in 3 minutes through Callaway Regional's administration channel, accessed by the second civilian agent who had set up at the security desk on the ground floor. Gil Marin had badged in at 5:51 a.m., 23 minutes before he called to report sick. He had accessed two areas, the ICU floor, which was his unit, and the second badge read 9 minutes after the first. The medical records archive on the basement level. The medical records archive. The room that no one entered without a specific administrative reason. The room that smelled like old paper and compressed storage, and where the records of 12 years of patient files lived in a filing system that was being converted to digital at the pace of an institution that did not have the budget to convert it faster. The room that Evelyn had been in exactly twice, both times to pull physical records for attending physicians who needed them for patient care decisions, because she was the nurse people sent on tasks like that, because she was thorough, and because she found things that other people missed. She had been in that room. She knew its geography. She looked at Vance. Basement, she said. They went back through the service entrance and down, because the stairwell that connected to the basement medical records archive was the central stairwell, not the east one, and the central stairwell had not been the one with a shadow on the landing. The building's internal nurse call alarm was still running, and the corridors had the altered quality of a space where something was wrong, and the staff knew it, but not what. And people were moving fast and talking low, and the particular controlled anxiety of a functional hospital responding to an unclear threat looked, from the outside, like barely managed disorder. The basement corridor was quieter, fewer staff. The archive room was at the end of a left branch off the main corridor, a door with a keypad and a badge reader, because paper records were still subject to privacy regulations even in a room no one prioritized. She badged it. Her badge didn't work. She had given her badge to Holt at 12:40. Right, she said. The agent had a universal hospital access credential, the kind that came with Federal Medical Authority designation, the kind she hadn't known existed before today. He swiped it. The door opened. The archive was what it always was. Rows of industrial shelving, acid-free boxes labeled by year and department, the specific cool dryness of a room kept at preservation temperature, overhead fluorescents that hummed at a frequency that became invisible after 30 seconds. And it was not empty. Gil Marin was sitting on the floor between the third and fourth shelving rows, his back against the metal upright, his knees drawn up, in the posture of someone who had sat down either to rest or because sitting down was the last decision they'd made. He was conscious. Barely. His right temple had a wound that had bled and dried and was now the dark rust color of old blood, and his left arm was braced against his body in the way that meant the shoulder wasn't right. Evelyn crossed the room and was beside him before anyone else moved. "Gil," she said. His eyes found her. Slow, the focusing effort of a concussive brain trying to assemble the present. "Gil, I need you to track my finger." His eyes tracked. Not perfectly, but they tracked. "What hurts most?" she said. "Head," he said. Then, "They came to my place. I got out the back." He swallowed. "I came here. I didn't know where else." "You badged in at 5:51. I had to move it." His eyes went to the shelving. The fourth row, upper section, where the boxes from the hospital's cardiac unit records from 11 years ago sat in a sequence that matched nothing in the current patient census. Third box from the left, back panel. She looked at Vance. He looked at the agent. The agent took the box from the shelf. He lifted the lid. Inside, under the paper records, against the back cardboard panel that the box's construction included as a structural element, was a thin sealed envelope fixed with evidence tape that had been signed across the seal in the small, precise handwriting of someone who understood that the integrity of the seal was the integrity of the evidence. Vance took it without opening it. He held it with the care of someone who had been looking for exactly this for a long time. "Is that enough?" Evelyn said. "Whatever's in there. Is that enough?" He looked at the envelope, then at her. "If it's what Solis said it is," he said, "then yes, it is more than enough." She looked at Gil Marin, who had let his head rest back against the metal shelf upright, and was watching the ceiling with the glazed persistence of a man who was going to have a significant concussion to manage in the next several hours, but had done the thing he came to do. "You need a CT," she said to him. "I know," he said, "and your shoulder needs imaging." "I know that too." She sat back on her heels and looked at the archive room. The shelving, the boxes, the acid-free order of 12 years of institutional memory. And she felt the thing that was not quite relief and not quite anger, beginning to shift into something else. Something that didn't have a clean name, but that was related to the particular feeling of a structure that has been held under load for a very long time, beginning to understand that the load is about to be redistributed. Then Vance's phone rang. He answered it. He listened for 11 seconds. His expression did the thing it did, which was nothing, which was everything. He lowered the phone. "What?" she said. "The transport was intercepted," he said. 12 minutes out. A vehicle ran a light and cut them off on Route 9 south. He paused. "The transport is intact. The driver evaded and they're rerouting, but what?" "The intercept vehicle," he said. "The driver. We got a plate off the traffic camera." He looked at her with the specific directness of someone delivering information that was going to change the shape of something she thought she understood. "The vehicle is registered to a company called Aldwick Consulting. It's a subsidiary." She waited. "Of Palliser Group," he said. "Tanner's company." She stood up. "He's not just monitoring," she said. "He has people here, in Millhaven. That's not a response team that flew in this morning." No, Vance said. "It's not." She looked at the envelope in his hand, then at the door to the archive room, and the corridor beyond it, and the hospital above them where the nurse call system had gone silent in the past few minutes in the particular way that things went silent when someone had decided the diversion was no longer needed. "He's been here," she said. "Tanner has had people embedded here. This wasn't about finding Solus after the fact. Someone in this building knew Solus was coming." The archive room's overhead fluorescent hummed. Vance looked at her. "We had one person in this hospital who knew about Solus," he said carefully. "One person who was contacted in advance as a safe point of contact." Gil Marin, on the floor, had gone still in a way that was not unconsciousness. His eyes were open, tracking the ceiling, but was the stillness of a man who understood that the sentence being constructed in the room was going to include his name. "I didn't tell anyone," Gil said. His voice was the voice of someone saying a thing they knew would not be taken on faith. "I didn't tell anyone he was coming." "I know," Evelyn said. But she was looking at Vance, and Vance was looking at his phone. And on the phone was a name she hadn't asked for yet, but was beginning to understand she already knew, because the architecture of it, the early badge-in, the called-in sick, the accessed archive, had a different shape than she'd given it when she first read it. Vance turned the phone so she could see the screen. The badge access log. Gil Marin's entry at 5:51. And below it, a second entry she hadn't been shown. A visitor badge, issued at the main desk at 5:37 a.m., 14 minutes before Gil came in. The visitor badge had been issued to a man who had signed in as a pharmaceutical representative. The name on the sign-in log was not a name she recognized, but the photograph attached to the visitor badge record, the automatic capture from the front desk camera, was a face she had seen that morning, in a context that had seemed unremarkable, in the specific way that things seemed unremarkable when they had been designed to. It was the face of the man who had been standing at the medication cart outside Bay 1 when the gurney came through the ambulance doors. She looked at the photograph for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. The face was not ambiguous. It was the face of a man she had registered without registering, the way you registered things in peripheral vision during a crisis, because the central focus was the patient, and the patient was dying, and everything else was background. He had been standing at the medication cart outside Bay 1 with a clipboard. Clipboards were unremarkable in hospitals. Men with clipboards near medication carts were unremarkable in hospitals. That was exactly the point. She handed the phone back to Vance. "He was on the floor when Solus came in," she said. "He saw the intake. He saw what I did." She paused. "He saw that Solus was alive." "Which means the intercept on Route 9 wasn't a response to the transport," Vance said. "They had the route before we did. Someone gave it to them. Or they had the hospital's communication system long enough to pull the transport authorization when Parrish signed it." He was already typing on his phone. "The maintenance panel access. They weren't just suppressing the intercom. They were reading outbound communications." She stood up. Her knees registered the protest of someone who had been crouching on a concrete floor and who was no longer 24. She ignored it. "The man in the photograph," she said. "Who is he?" "Working on that," Vance said. Then 30 seconds later, looking at his screen. "Visitor log has him as Derek Saul, pharmaceutical rep for a company called Meridex Health Solutions. He looked up. Meridex Health Solutions does not exist. The address on the REPI registration is a mail forwarding service in Reston, Virginia. Reston, 20 minutes from the capital. The kind of location that meant something specific in the context of private defense contracting. Palliser Group has an office in Reston, she said. Yes. She looked at the sealed envelope in Vance's hand, then at Gil Marin on the floor, who had stopped tracking the ceiling and was now watching the exchange with the focused attention of a man in significant pain who understood that what was being said in this room determined what happened next. We need to move him, she said, meaning Gil. The second team is 4 minutes out, Vance said. They can transport him to a secured medical facility along with, not a military facility, she said. He needs a CT and imaging and a neurologist, and military medical facilities are good for many things. But neurological triage in a concussive patient with unknown bleed risk is not what they're optimized for. She said it the way she said clinical things, not as an argument, just as a fact that had weight. Callaway Regional has a neurologist on call, Dr. Priya Anand. She's good. If there's a bleed, I want Anand looking at the scan. Vance looked at her for a moment. You're asking me to keep him in the building where someone just accessed the communication system. I'm asking you to treat his head injury correctly, she said. You secure the floor, get your people on every access point, but the man needs a neurologist, not a field medic. He made the call. While he made it, she crouched back down to Gil's level. The envelope, she said. Did you look at what's in it? He shook his head, then stopped because the shaking clearly cost him. Solis told me not to. Good. Is it going to be enough? He said. Whatever's in there. She thought about how to answer that honestly without answering it in a way that required more certainty than she had. I think so, she said. If it's what Solis said it was. He said it was everything, Gil said. He said it was 3 years of everything. 3 years. The same 3 years she had spent in a hospital that called her the librarian, reorganizing supply cabinets and catching medication errors, and carrying the weight of a determination that said she had failed when she had been made to fail by someone with access and motive and no accountability. She didn't say any of that. When the second team gets here, she said, you tell them everything. Where you were when you received the material from Solis, how you got it, where you put it, who you told, everything. That'll take a while? You'll have time, she said. You're not going anywhere until Anand clears you anyway. The second team arrived in 6 minutes rather than 4, which was the kind of gap that happened when vehicles took the south route to avoid the east lot, where the 2 surveillance vehicles were still positioned, and which Vance had, in the interval, had flagged to the Millhaven Police Department through a federal liaison channel that produced a response in 12 minutes, and a very uncomfortable conversation for 2 men who had no legitimate explanation for why they were parked in a hospital lot with no license plates. The Millhaven PD did not fully understand what they had, but they had it, and that was sufficient for the moment. Gil Marin was moved upstairs on a gurney through the same service corridor they'd used for Solis, and Evelyn went with him because she had given her word to Anand's answering service that the patient's clinical picture would be presented accurately, and the answering service had said Anand would be in within 30 minutes, and Evelyn intended to be there when she arrived. The CT happened at 4:10 in the afternoon. Anand read it at 4:27, standing in the radiology bay with the focused attention of someone for whom imaging was a language and who was reading it without needing to translate. The verdict was a grade 2 concussion, no intracranial hemorrhage, and a posterior shoulder dislocation that would need reduction but not surgery. He's lucky, Anand said, looking at the CT. He's stubborn, Evelyn said. Different thing. Anand glanced at her. A brief assessment of the woman who had apparently been suspended that morning and was now standing in her radiology bay in the company of federal agents and looked like she hadn't eaten since before dawn. Do you want coffee? She said. I want to know the shoulder reduction is done before anyone moves him again, Evelyn said. 20 minutes, Anand said, and then I want him admitted for overnight observation. He'll fight that. I know, Anand said. I've met stubborn before. Evelyn left Gil in Anand's care, which was where he needed to be, and went back down. The sealed envelope had been opened, not by Vance alone. In the main floor conference room that the hospital had made available to the federal team, there were now 4 additional people she hadn't seen before. 2 in the specific civilian clothes that meant federal law, one in a uniform that had a different insignia from Vance's, and a woman in her 50s in a plain blazer who was sitting at the head of the conference table and looking at the contents of the envelope with the expression of someone reading something they had theorized for a long time and were now confirming. The contents were not digital files. They were printed documents, transaction records, communication logs, contractor approval chains, printed on the kind of paper that was used for secure document output. The weight and finish of it, different from standard office paper. The kind of thing that came from a facility with specific standards for physical document production. There were also 2 compact data cards in a sleeve, the physical medium that Solis had mentioned, containing encrypted files whose decryption keys were presumably known to someone in this room or coming to this room shortly. Evelyn stood in the doorway. The woman at the head of the table looked up. "You're Marsh," she said. "Yes." "Sit down." Not an invitation, not quite an order. The tone of someone for whom both categories had collapsed into a single register through long practice. "I'm Assistant Director Calloway, no relation to the hospital, from the Defense Intelligence Field Office. I've been briefed on what happened today." She looked at Evelyn with the directness of someone for whom looking at things directly was a professional tool. "And I've been briefed on Keene Valley." Evelyn sat. She sat with the specific posture of someone who had been sitting in chairs in front of people with authority for a very long time and had long since stopped performing comfort she didn't feel. "The documents Mr. Solis carried," the assistant director said, "contained communication records between Raymond Tanner, regional director of Palliser Group, and 3 senior officials in the contracting chain that oversaw your unit's deployment to Keene Valley." She paused, not for effect, but for accuracy. "They include a communication dated 4 days before the Keene Valley operation, in which Tanner explicitly directed the alteration of the sector intelligence assessment to remove a threat indicator that your unit's mission planning relied on." Evelyn looked at the table. "He removed the indicator," she said, "deliberately. The communication makes clear he had a financial interest in a weapons technology contract that would only activate if the operation was deemed a failure, requiring equipment replacement. A successful operation would have produced a review that questioned the contract's necessity." The assistant director's voice was flat and professional and carried the specific weight of someone saying an ugly thing without dressing it up. "He removed the threat indicator. Your unit went in without the correct picture. People were hurt. And when the inquiry convened, Tanner's position in the contracting chain gave him access to the inquiry's evidence review, which he used to redirect the determination toward field error." Toward Evelyn. She had known the shape of it for 3 years. Knowing the specific mechanism was different. It was the difference between knowing something fell and seeing the thing that cut the wire. "The inquiry's determination," she said. "Can it be reopened?" "It will be," the assistant director said. "Not can, will." She said it with the certainty of someone who had the authority to make that sentence true. "The determination against you will be formally vacated and your service record will be corrected to reflect the actual circumstances of the operation." Evelyn sat with that. The fluorescent light in the conference room hummed the same way fluorescent lights hummed everywhere. That universal institutional frequency that she had been listening to for 3 years in corridors and break rooms and administrative offices where people told her what she was and wasn't. "What about Tanner?" she said. "The documents, combined with Mr. Solis's testimony once he's well enough to give it, represent a federal criminal case. Obstruction of a military inquiry, fraudulent contract procurement, conspiracy to commit assault, the attack on Solis. And we're examining the Keene Valley circumstances for additional charges under statutes covering interference with military operations." The assistant director looked at the documents on the table. "He will not be difficult to prosecute. The paper trail is specific." Vance, who had been standing near the window throughout, said, "We need him in custody before he knows the envelope has been opened." "My team is coordinating with federal marshals," the assistant director said. "Tanner is currently at a hotel in Columbus, which is close enough to Millhaven to suggest he intended to be here for whatever outcome today produced." She paused. "He won't make it to the lobby." There was a knock at the conference room door. One of the federal agents opened it. In the doorway was Tanya Osei, and behind Tanya was a posture that Evelyn recognized before the face resolved. Francis Holt, chief of emergency medicine, who had spent the day constructing an administrative case against a nurse he had suspended for saving a patient's life, and who was now standing in the doorway of a conference room occupied by a Defense Intelligence Assistant Director and a colonel from Army Medical Special Operations, and several people whose affiliations were not printed on badges. Holt looked at the room. He looked at Evelyn. Something happened in his face that was not a single emotion but a sequence. The rapid recalibration of a man whose model of the situation had just been replaced by a different and significantly more complicated one. "Dr. Holt," the assistant director said, "please come in. We were going to ask for you shortly anyway." He came in. He sat down, though no one had said sit. The sitting was involuntary, the body making the decision that standing was no longer the right register for this room. Vance put a one-page document on the table in front of him. "This is the Federal Medical Authority designation that covers Nurse Marsh's actions today, including her presence in clinical areas following your suspension order. The designation was formally invoked at 2:47 this afternoon and retroactively covers her actions from the point of the patient's admission." Holt looked at the document. "That doesn't address the protocol violation." "It does, actually," Vance said. "Under federal medical authority, clinical personnel acting in support of a protected patient's care are exempt from institutional disciplinary action for the duration of the operational period. Your suspension is legally suspended." The sentence had a particular precision that was not accidental. Evelyn noticed it and did not react to it, because reacting would have meant something she wasn't interested in performing. "Furthermore," the assistant director said, "we will be requesting Nurse Marsh's personnel file from this institution as part of the federal case documentation. What we are not requesting, Dr. Holt, is a revocation proceeding. What we are formally advising against is any further adverse action." She said it without heat, without emphasis. It was the tone of someone who didn't need emphasis because the weight was already in the words. Holt looked at the table. His jaw moved. He was a man who had spent a long time being the authority in rooms, and he was in a room where he was not the authority and had not been the authority since 3 vehicles with specific antenna configurations had parked in the south lot. And he was processing that with the particular difficulty of someone for whom the processing had no good outcome. "The patient," he said finally. "The one the needle decompression." He stopped. "Is he alive?" "Yes," Vance said. "Because of what she did." "Yes." Holt looked at Evelyn. The look had something in it she hadn't expected, which was the specific discomfort of a person confronting the gap between the decision they made and the decision the facts supported. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had operated inside a framework of authority so long that the framework had become the truth, and the framework had been wrong, and he was looking at the person the framework had dismissed and trying to find the language for that. "I didn't know your background," he said. "No," she said. "I should have—" He stopped. The file was incomplete," she said. "I know." He looked at the table again. "The board meeting this afternoon. I'll withdraw the revocation filing." "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without irony and without warmth, because it was the right thing to say, and she had been taught, in places she was now beginning to allow herself to think about again, that graciousness in the moment of someone's acknowledgement cost nothing and mattered more than most people understood. He nodded once. He stood. He left the room with the particular quiet of a man who had more thinking to do than the present moment allowed. Tanya Osei, who had been standing in the doorway the entire time, watched him go. Then she looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not quite an apology and not quite admiration, but was something in the neighborhood of both, the expression of someone who had called a colleague the librarian for 3 years and was revising that assessment in real time. She didn't say anything. She left. The conference room settled. The assistant director gathered the documents from the table with the careful handling of someone who understood they were evidence, and that evidence had a chain of custody that began the moment it was touched. She looked at Evelyn. "There's one more thing," she said. The room's quality changed. Vance had gone still in the specific way he went still when something important was arriving. "The communication records in Solis's documents include a distribution list," the assistant director said. "Tanner's internal communications about the Keene Valley operation were not sent to 3 people. They were sent to 7. She opened one of the printed pages and turned it so Evelyn could read the header. 4 of those 7 we have already identified and will be moving on concurrently with Tanner's arrest. 3 remain unidentified by name. They appear in the communication chain under internal Palliser group codes. She paused. One of those codes appears in a second context in the documents, a financial context. A Palliser Group subsidiary account that received payments on a schedule that corresponds exactly to the dates following specific Callaway regional administrative decisions in the past 18 months. Evelyn looked at her. A subsidiary account that received payments linked to decisions made inside this hospital, the assistant director said, suggests that someone inside this hospital has been on Palliser Group's payroll. The conference room's fluorescent light hummed. Someone who made administrative decisions, Evelyn said. Not a question. The payment schedule corresponds to 4 specific events, the assistant director said. The rejection of 2 equipment upgrade proposals that would have improved the hospital's patient tracking and communication infrastructure. The approval of a single vendor contract for the hospital's communication routing system, the same routing system that was accessed through the maintenance panel today. She paused. And the 4th event, a staffing decision made 8 months ago that reassigned the night shift ICU charge to a rotation that put Gil Marin on predictable, documented nights. The weight of that last one took a moment to fully assemble. Someone had arranged for Gil Marin to be on a predictable schedule, had made an administrative staffing decision that ensured Solis's contact at Callaway Regional was visible and trackable, had sold that information, or had been paid for the decision that produced it through a subsidiary account that connected back to Palliser Group. Someone with the authority to make staffing decisions, administrative decisions, contract approvals. Who signed staffing decisions at Callaway Regional? Vance said. He was looking at Evelyn when he said it because she had been here for 3 years and she knew the institution. She knew exactly who signed staffing decisions. She knew who had approved the communication routing vendor contract. She knew who had been in the administrative review meeting when the equipment upgrade proposals had been rejected. Meeting she had walked past in the corridor and glanced through the window and seen the attendees the way she saw everything, because 3 years of paying attention accumulated into a complete picture of an institution, whether you wanted it to or not. She looked at the assistant director. You need to find Dr. Francis Holt, she said, right now. The assistant director was already on her phone before Evelyn finished the sentence because the assistant director was not a person who required things explained twice. But through the conference room window that looked into the main corridor, Evelyn could already see the answer to where Holt was, because the east corridor was visible from this angle, and the east corridor led to the administrative offices, and the administrative offices had an exit to the hospital's attached parking structure, and the parking structure had multiple vehicle egress points that connected to 3 different streets. Holt's office light was off. She hadn't seen him leave through the conference room doorway. There was another exit from this corridor. She had reorganized supply cabinets. She had walked this building. She knew the exits. She was moving before anyone in the room had finished making a call. The corridor outside the conference room was empty in the specific way that corridors went empty when everyone had moved towards something. The federal team mobilizing, the hospital staff responding to the afternoon's accumulating disruptions. And Evelyn moved through it with the quality of motion she had spent 3 years suppressing, the kind that didn't announce itself, that covered ground without looking like it was covering ground. She knew this building. That was the thing nobody had ever thought to consider. Not Holt, not the board, not the staff who called her the librarian and meant it as a diminishment. 3 years of arriving 12 minutes early and taking the inefficient routes because the inefficient routes showed her things. 3 years of walking equipment carts through service corridors and reorganizing supply rooms and pulling archive records because those were the tasks nobody else wanted. And the tasks nobody else wanted took you through the parts of a building that everyone else had stopped seeing. She knew the administrative wing had a secondary exit. It was at the end of the east corridor, past the records manager's office, through a door marked authorized staff that connected to the stairwell behind the billing department. And that stairwell had a ground floor exit that opened onto the narrow service alley between the hospital's main structure and the attached parking garage. She knew it because 8 months ago she had gone to billing to resolve a patient's insurance discrepancy that had been sitting unresolved for 11 days, and the billing clerk had walked her out through that door when the main corridor was blocked by a maintenance crew resealing the floor. She took the service alley route. The alley was dim in the late afternoon, the gap between structures holding shadow earlier than the open lot. She came out at the garage entrance end and stopped. Holt was there. He was 40 feet ahead of her, at the garage's pedestrian entrance, with his keys in his hand and the posture of a man moving with intention. Not running, because running was visible, and he had spent enough time in authority to understand that visibility was its own liability, but walking with the compressed urgency of someone whose internal clock had reached a threshold. He had his coat on. He had his bag. He had made a decision in the interval between leaving the conference room and now that his body had already committed to. She said his name, not loud. She didn't need loud in an alley. He stopped. He turned, and the expression on his face in that moment was not what she'd expected, which was fear or calculation or the flat denial of someone who had prepared a story. It was something more complicated than any of those. The face of a man who had been managing a version of himself for so long that the management had become the self. And now the version was coming apart, and what was underneath it was tired in a way that went deeper than one afternoon. "Marsh," he said. "Don't," she said, not aggressively, just as a statement about what was coming next if he finished whatever he was assembling. There are federal agents in the building who know what the payment records show. There are 2 exits to this garage, and both of them connect to streets that have been flagged. He looked at her. He looked at the garage entrance. He looked at his keys. "I didn't know they were going to hurt anyone," he said. She heard it. She let it sit in the air between them without immediately responding, because the sentence required the space to be what it was, which was the first honest thing he had said to her all day, possibly the first honest thing he had said out loud to anyone in longer than that. "The routing contract," she said. "The staffing rotation. You made administrative decisions for money, and you told yourself the decisions were minor." He didn't answer. "And then a man ended up on an access road this morning," she said. "And you had to decide whether what you'd done contributed to that, and you decided it hadn't, and that decision was wrong." "I didn't know what Palliser was." "You knew enough," she said. "You knew the payments were not for consulting. You knew the decisions they were paying for had specific operational value to someone who wasn't the hospital." She said it without raising her voice, the way she said clinical things, because that was what it was. A diagnosis, not an accusation. "You're a good doctor, Dr. Holt. That's the part that's going to be hardest to live with." He looked at the ground. His keys were still in his hand. He wasn't going to run. She'd known that before she came into the alley. Not because she'd calculated it, but because she'd spent 3 years reading people accurately in high-pressure moments, and she had read him accurately in the conference room when he said he'd withdraw the revocation filing. That was not a man with a clean escape plan. That was a man who had been hoping the conference room would be the end of it. She heard the door at the alley's far end open. Vance and one of the federal agents came through it at a pace that was not running, but was not walking either, and Holt turned at the sound and looked at them, and his shoulders dropped in a way that was not submission, but release. The letting go of something he'd been holding up for a long time. "Dr. Holt," Vance said, "we need you to come back inside." Holt looked at Evelyn one more time. "I'm sorry," he said, "for this morning, for all of it." She nodded. Once. That was all she gave him, because that was all she had to give, and because sorry didn't reconstitute the morning or give back the badge she'd set on his desk or fix the 3 years of a building that called her the librarian. It was a true thing, and it was insufficient, and both of those could be simultaneously the case, and she had long since stopped expecting otherwise from people whose failures were the expensive kind. She watched Vance and the agent take Holt back through the door. She stood in the alley for a moment in the late afternoon dimness, the parking garage concrete on her left, and the hospital's exterior wall on her right, and the sound of the city at a low ambient frequency, traffic, a distant signal, a bird somewhere on the garage roof making a sound out of proportion to its size. Then she went back inside. The next 4 hours were institutional rather than dramatic, which was true of most things after the acute phase ended. The federal team worked through the hospital with the systematic efficiency of people who understood that thoroughness now prevented complications later. Raymond Tanner was arrested at his Columbus hotel at 5:49 in the afternoon by federal marshals who reported, through Vance's communication channel, that he had not resisted and had asked for his lawyer before he had finished being told the charges, which was the behavior of someone who had been expecting this possibility and had prepared for it, which was its own kind of confirmation. Warren Solis's transport reached the secured medical facility without further incident. The rerouting had added 22 minutes to the transfer, which mattered medically and had been managed by the EMT on board with the competence of someone who understood that managing it was the job. Solis was admitted, stabilized, and by 7 that evening was coherent enough to begin a preliminary debrief with Vance's division that would, Vance told her later, take several days to complete fully, but had already produced enough additional testimony to expand the federal case from a document-based proceeding to a multi-count criminal conspiracy with named defendants in 3 states. Gil Marin's shoulder was reduced at 620 by an orthopedic resident who was 29 and nervous about doing it without an attending in the room until Anand told him he was capable and she was in the building if he needed her, which was the right thing to say and produced the right result. He was admitted for overnight observation. His CT remained clean at the evening read. When Evelyn looked in on him at 7:45, he was sitting up in the bed with the hospital's terrible coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, already answering the federal team's documentation requests with the meticulous thoroughness of a man for whom being thorough was a professional identity. "How's the head?" she said. "Present," he said, "which is better than the alternative. Anand's going to want you here through tomorrow." "I know." He looked at her with the particular look of someone assembling a question they weren't sure how to ask. "Did you know, before today, about what I was holding for him?" "No," she said. "He picked this hospital specifically," Gil said. "He told me that when he contacted me. 18 months ago, he reached out through a channel I won't go into, and he said if something happened to him, he needed someone at Callaway Regional, someone who could hold something without anyone thinking to look at them twice." He paused. He said the person he really needed was a nurse named Marsh, but she'd be the first one they'd watch. She stood with that for a moment. Solis had known about her, had built around her because her proximity to the situation made her a liability for him, even as her skills made her, in the immediate crisis, the only person in the building who could keep him alive long enough for any of it to matter. The whole day had a structural logic to it that she hadn't seen until now, standing in an ICU room with bad overhead lighting and a styrofoam cup of bad coffee on the bedside table. "Get some sleep," she said to Gil. "After I finish this," he said, meaning the documentation. "Gil." 20 minutes, he said. She left him to it. The conference room had been converted by 9 that evening into a working space for the federal team's documentation and communication, and the assistant director was still there. Still in her plain blazer, still at the head of the table, the kind of person whose working hours were defined by the work rather than by a clock. She looked up when Evelyn came in. "Sit," she said. Evelyn sat. "The data cards from Solis's documentation have been partially decrypted," the assistant director said. "I want to tell you what they contain that specifically pertains to you before it enters the formal record, because you deserve to hear it from a person and not from a document." She waited. "The Keene Valley Inquiry," the assistant director said. "The modified intelligence assessment that Tanner altered. The decrypted files include his internal communication justifying the alteration. He was specific about it. He needed the operation to fail in a way that produced maximum equipment loss and minimum survivor credibility. He specifically identified you as the tactical lead most likely to be believable as the source of a field error." She paused. "He considered you a risk because you were skilled enough that a competence-based defense would hold up in review, so he structured the evidence around a judgment call rather than a competence question. It was designed to survive scrutiny." Evelyn looked at the table. "He thought about me specifically," she said. "He considered you the most dangerous person in your unit in terms of potential to contradict the official determination," the assistant director said. "He was correct about that. He just miscalculated the timeline." She looked at the table for another moment. Then, "How many people from my unit were affected by the determination?" 4 received adverse marks on their service records linked to the Keene Valley findings. 2 separated from service earlier than they would have otherwise. The adverse findings will be reviewed and vacated as part of the federal proceeding. The assistant director looked at her. "It will take time. These things always do. But it will happen." "What do they need to do?" Evelyn said. "The people from my unit." "They'll be contacted by the JAG office," the assistant director said. "But if you have a way to reach them directly, a word from you wouldn't go wrong. People who've been told the same lie for 3 years sometimes need to hear the correction from someone they know before the official version lands." She knew 2 of them, not well. The unit had scattered, which was what happened to units after something went wrong, but well enough. She had their contact information in a form she had kept without being sure why, at the back of the part of her memory that she'd been not visiting. She was going to visit it now. The formal proceedings that followed in the coming weeks were the kind of thing that happened slowly and with significant paperwork and without the dramatic clarity of a single moment, which was the honest truth about how institutions acknowledged their failures. In increments, through channels, with language that was careful, because careful language was how institutions protected themselves even when acknowledging wrongdoing. Raymond Tanner was federally charged on 11 counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of military proceedings, fraudulent contract procurement, and 3 counts related to the attack on Warren Solis. His legal team entered a not guilty plea that anyone who had read the document contents understood was a procedural step rather than an argument. Francis Holt cooperated with federal investigators and provided a complete account of the payment arrangement, which had begun not with an explicit offer of corruption, but in the way that these things often began, a consulting relationship that drifted, a boundary that moved incrementally, a decision that seemed administrative until it wasn't. He resigned from Callaway Regional 2 days after his arrest, and before any termination proceeding could be initiated, which was the exit of a man who understood that his position was untenable and chose the version of leaving that preserved the smallest remaining piece of what he'd been. He would face charges relating to the payment arrangement. They would not be minor. The hospital board met in emergency session and appointed an interim chief of emergency medicine and authorized a full internal audit of vendor contracts and staffing decisions over the previous 3 years. It was the kind of audit that institutions ordered when they had been made to understand that not ordering it would look worse than ordering it, but the result was real regardless of the motivation, and the result included a public statement that was, by the standards of institutional public statements, unusually direct. Callaway Regional acknowledged the Federal Medical Authority review of the Marsh suspension, withdrew all adverse actions, and stated that Nurse Evelyn Marsh's clinical judgment on the day in question had been correct. They didn't call her the librarian after that. They didn't call her anything for a few days, which was its own form of the institution recalibrating. People who had operated around her in one register trying to find the register that was appropriate now that the frame had changed. She understood it. She had watched it happen before with other people in other contexts, the social recalibration that followed a major revision of who someone was understood to be. She was patient with it the way she was patient with most institutional processes, without enthusiasm, but without resentment. Tanya Osei was the first one to say anything real. She found Evelyn in the break room at the beginning of a shift, 9 days after, making the same coffee she made every morning because the coffee at Callaway Regional was bad, and she had accepted this about the coffee 3 years ago, and it had not changed. Tanya came in and made her own coffee and stood at the counter for a moment without saying anything, and then she said, "I'm sorry for the librarian thing." Evelyn looked at her. "You weren't wrong about the systems part," she said. "I do have a system for everything." "That's not why we said it." "No," she said. "I know." Tanya looked at her coffee. "What was it like? Before?" "The unit." Evelyn considered how to answer that honestly. "Hard," she said. "Necessary. The kind of thing where you find out what you're made of, and the answer is both better and worse than you thought." She paused. "Mostly, I remember the people. The ones you saved. The ones I didn't," she said. "Those stay longer." Tanya was quiet for a moment. Then, "For what it's worth, the kid in Bay 7 that morning, the one with the fever." She looked at Evelyn. "The pediatric consult you flagged. The attending found a UTI that was tracking towards sepsis. The mother didn't know. If it had gone another 6 hours..." She stopped. "That was you. Nobody's going to put that on a board anywhere." Evelyn looked at her coffee. "That's most of the job," she said. "The part nobody puts on a board." 3 weeks after the day that had rearranged everything, Vance came back to Callaway Regional. Not with a convoy, alone, in a vehicle that was the fleet car kind without the antenna configuration, in civilian clothes that still looked like a uniform because some things were too deeply installed to dress around. He came to the east entrance because she had told him that was the one she used, and he found her in the break room because she had told him her shift started at 6 and he had arrived at 5:50. He had an offer. It was the kind of offer that was not delivered on a form because the things that mattered weren't delivered on forms. It was delivered over bad coffee at a table in a break room that smelled like floor cleaner and someone's forgotten lunch, which was exactly the right setting for it. There's a program being developed, he said, under Army Medical Special Operations. Field medical training with an emphasis on austere environment care, trauma management in conditions where you don't have the equipment or the staff or the time that standard protocols assume. The kind of training that bridges what civilian medical personnel know and what military operational medicine requires. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The person who designs it and runs it needs to understand both sides of that bridge from direct experience, not from reading about it. She looked at him. You're asking me to come back. I'm asking you to build something that didn't fully exist before, he said. That's different from coming back. It was different. She sat with the difference. I'm a nurse at a level 2 trauma center in Mill Haven, Ohio, she said. You're a person who saved a federal intelligence operative's life with a 14-gauge needle and institutional-grade stubbornness, he said. You can be both things. She almost smiled. Not quite. The program? Where would it be based? Flexible. We'd need you for the design phase, which is approximately 6 months of curriculum and protocol development. After that, the delivery model can be distributed, training conducted at multiple sites, some of them civilian. He paused. The gap between what civilian emergency nurses know and what they'd need to know in a mass casualty event or a domestic emergency situation is significant. You know that. You've known it since you walked into Callaway Regional. She had known it since her first week. She had known it the first time she watched an ED team freeze in front of a tension pneumothorax because the textbook version and the real version looked different under pressure. She had known it, and she had compensated for it at the individual level. One patient, one shift, one quietly caught error at a time, because that was the scope available to her. This was a different scope. I'd need to stay on staff here in some capacity, she said, part-time, at minimum. There are patients here. That's negotiable, he said. And the program has to include civilian nurses, she said, not just military medical personnel. If the point is the bridge, both sides of the bridge need to walk it. That's already in the proposal, he said. You'd have influence over the curriculum and participant criteria. She looked at the bad coffee. She thought about the push bar on the east entrance and the lanyard with the compass clip and the 3 years of arriving 12 minutes early and being invisible and doing the job anyway, because the job was the job, regardless of who was watching. She thought about the sealed box at the back of a storage unit she'd been not visiting, and about how the box was already open now. Had been open since the moment a man on a gurney stopped breathing and her hands remembered what they knew. And about what it meant to stop pretending you were less than what you were in order to fit inside a space that had been built for someone smaller. She thought about Harold in Bay 6, apologizing for being a patient. About Sonia in Bay 7 with her shoes off and her daughter finally asleep. About the pediatric consult she had flagged and the fever that had been tracking towards sepsis and the fact that nobody would put that on a board. She thought up about the 2 people from her unit whose contact information she'd kept without knowing why, and the calls she had made last week, and the way their voices had sounded when she told them what Solis's files had confirmed. The specific sound of people who had carried something false for 3 years and had just been told they could put it down. Yes, she said. Vance looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment, which was the right response. He was not a man who filled silence to manage it. One condition, she said. What? Gil Marin comes with me, as a co-developer for the ICU module. He's good, and he's been running field-adjacent protocols in a civilian context for 4 years. And if this program is supposed to bridge both sides of the gap, he's exactly the kind of person who should be building it. Vance almost smiled. Also, not quite. I'll put it in the proposal. Warren Solis was discharged from the secured medical facility 31 days after the morning he'd been left on the access road. He walked out on his own, which his medical team had told him would be possible, but which had not seemed possible from the inside of the first week, when the chest tube was still in and the concussive effects of the skull injury were producing headaches that came in waves, and the cardiac contusion made sustained effort hurt in ways that were instructive about how little margin he'd had. He walked out, and 2 weeks after that, he gave a complete deposition that took 3 days and that the federal prosecution team described as the most thoroughly documented testimony they had received in a case of this type. He called Evelyn once before the deposition, not to coordinate, not to ask anything, just to call. You didn't know me, he said, in that bay. You didn't know what I carried or what it meant. You were the patient, she said. Yeah, he said. I know, but I want you to know it mattered. Not just the needle, the whole thing. A pause. I read your file. After Keene Valley. I knew what they'd done to you. I thought, if I could get to Callaway Regional, if I could get the files into the right hands, maybe that was something I could fix. He paused again. I didn't expect to need fixing myself. Most people don't, she said. He was quiet for a moment. How are you? She thought about it. It was not a question she was usually asked by people who meant it, and he meant it, and that deserved an honest answer. Better, she said. Not fixed. Better. That's the right answer, he said. Raymond Tanner pleaded guilty on 7 of the 11 counts. 14 weeks after his arrest, negotiating the plea arrangement with the particular strategic calculation of someone who understood that the evidentiary case against him was comprehensive and that the remaining 4 counts, if tried, would produce a worse outcome than the negotiated sentence. The guilty plea was entered in a federal courthouse in Columbus on a Tuesday afternoon that was unremarkable in every way except the specific way it was not, which was that a man who had deliberately destroyed the careers and records of people who had served their country in good faith, who had arranged for the alteration of intelligence that put those people in danger, and who had then paid for the suppression of the investigation that might have revealed it. That man said the word guilty in a courtroom, and the word had consequences. The sentence was 22 years. The judge's remarks at sentencing were not brief. She said, among other things, that the damage done to military personnel and their families through the deliberate corruption of inquiry processes was a specific kind of harm, invisible, institutional, carried privately for years by people who had no mechanism to challenge it, and that the sentence reflected not only the criminal acts enumerated in the counts, but the weight of that particular category of harm. Evelyn read the sentencing transcript. She read it once, in full, at the table in the break room at Callaway Regional on a morning before her shift started. She put her phone down when she finished. She did not feel the clean satisfaction that the stories she'd grown up with had suggested she would feel when something like this resolved. She felt something more complicated and more honest, a kind of settling, like a building that had been compensating for an uneven foundation finally being releveled, the adjustment subtle but structural. The weight had not gone away. The years had not unhappened. The soldiers who had separated from service early, the careers that had been bent by a false determination, the version of herself she had packed into a box and moved to the back of a storage unit. None of that was restored by a sentencing transcript. But it was acknowledged, and acknowledgement was not nothing. Acknowledgement, she had learned, was what allowed you to stop spending energy on the question of whether it was real. She picked up her badge, the new one, with the updated role designation that reflected both her clinical position and her status as an adjunct trainer for the Army Medical Special Operations curriculum, and clipped it to the lanyard with the compass emblem, and she went to work. 6 months after the day that had changed everything, Callaway Regional's emergency department had 2 new protocols in its training rotation, one for tension pneumothorax management under resource-limited conditions, and one for mass casualty triage using the modified field methodology that Evelyn had spent 3 years watching civilian teams fumble through without the vocabulary to name what they were missing. The protocols were being piloted at 3 other regional hospitals in Ohio. 2 more had requested the program. The first training cohort at Callaway Regional included 4 nurses and 2 attending physicians. The physicians had initially been resistant in the way that physicians were sometimes resistant to learning from nurses, the professional hierarchy producing a kind of institutional squinting at the arrangement. Evelyn had not addressed this directly. She had simply run the first session, and the first session had been the kind of session where what you knew became visible through what you did rather than through what you said. And by the end of it, the squinting had stopped. She was not a person who needed them to apologize. She needed them to learn. That was the job. On the last day of the first cohort's training, one of the attending physicians, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who was 34 and sharp and had arrived at the first session with her arms metaphorically crossed, stopped Evelyn at the end of the debrief and said, "Where did you learn to think like this?" Evelyn considered how to answer. "I learned it where most people learn the things that stick," she said. "Under pressure, with people I didn't want to fail." Reyes looked at her. "We've had a lot of good nurses at this hospital," she said, "but I don't think any of us—" She stopped, started again. We didn't see you. No, Evelyn said. That was our failure. Yes, she said. It was. She said it simply, without cruelty and without absolution, because it was the truth, and the truth didn't require dressing. The ambulance bay was quiet that evening when she walked through it on the way out. The end of a shift that had included 2 trauma cases, one pediatric respiratory event that had been caught early enough to manage without escalation, and 4 hours of administrative work on the curriculum module for the next training cohort. The bay held the specific smell of exhaust and cold air, and the metal and rubber particular to a space that was always waiting for the next thing. She stood in it for a moment. She thought about who she had been in this doorway 6 months ago. The woman who had set her badge on a desk and kept the lanyard because it was hers, who had stood in diesel-scented air and heard her name from a man she'd never met, and felt 3 years of careful construction begin to fracture. She thought about what it had cost to build that version of herself. The smallness of it, the discipline required to sustain smallness, the particular exhaustion of spending every shift being more than the space allowed and then going home and managing the excess so it didn't show. She thought about the soldiers whose contact information she'd kept without knowing why. She thought about Harold, apologizing for being a patient. She thought about the fact that the things that happened in Bay 1, in a hallway, in a service corridor, in a basement archive, none of them had been smooth. They had been improvised and imperfect and contingent on decisions made in fractions of seconds with incomplete information, the way most things that mattered actually happened, without the clarity that the stories assigned after the fact. She had made mistakes in the margins of that day that she would think about for a long time. The 45 seconds she'd spent against the wall when she could have been moving. The moment in the service corridor when her situational awareness had narrowed. The badge she'd handed over without arguing harder, which had complicated the next 2 hours. She had done those things. They were hers. And she had also done the other things, and those were hers too. What she knew, what she had always known and had been asked to unknow for 3 years and had refused to unknow even while pretending she had, was that skill did not require permission. Competence did not require recognition in order to exist. You could be capable in a room full of people who had decided you were not, and their decision did not change the fact of your capability, only the opportunity to use it. An opportunity eventually arrived. Not because the world was fair. The world was not fair. Tanner's corruption had run for years before it was stopped. Gil Marin had been injured. Solis had spent 22 months alone with something dangerous. 2 people from her unit had left service earlier than they should have, carrying a false record that had bent their trajectories in ways that could not be fully straightened. The world was not fair, but it was not static. And the people who understood that who kept their skills alive in the quiet years, who reorganized supply cabinets and caught medication errors and flagged pediatric consults in the margins of invisibility because the work was the work, regardless of who was watching, those people were ready when the moment arrived. That was the thing she would tell the next training cohort. Not as a lesson, not as a motivational speech, which she would not be good at and did not intend to deliver, just as a fact about how things actually worked, from someone who had tested the fact under conditions that did not allow for abstract answers. You do the job, every day, at the level it requires. The recognition is secondary, the work is primary, and the work, if you do it honestly, is its own justification. She clipped her badge. She walked to the east entrance. The push bar was still stiff, the overhead light still flickering twice before it held, the corridor beyond it still smelling like floor sealer, and the particular ambient residue of a building that existed for the unrelenting work of keeping people alive. She pushed through the door. He sent a written communication, not an email, an actual letter, handwritten on plain paper in the small, precise script she had seen on the evidence tape seal, that arrived at Callaway Regional, addressed to her and was given to her by the front desk administrator, with the slightly puzzled expression of someone who was not accustomed to receiving military-adjacent correspondence for a floor nurse. She read it in the break room. It was not long, 3 paragraphs. The first was about his medical recovery, which was proceeding and was expected to be complete. The second was about the Keene Valley mission, specific things she had not known, details from the ground-level debrief that never reached her because she had been separated from service before the full debrief concluded. He wrote about the soldiers she had stabilized in the collapsed structure. He wrote about what they had said, in their own debriefs, about the person who had kept them alive when survival was not the likely outcome. He wrote those things without editorializing because the facts were sufficient and he understood that. The third paragraph was short. I know what it costs to carry something alone for a long time. I know what it costs to have the wrong name on the wrong document and to keep showing up anyway. I don't know what you're planning to do next, but I know that whatever it is, you'll be the most qualified person in the room, and the room probably won't know it. That's fine. You know it. That's the one that counts. She folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket. She went back to the floor. Colonel Darius Vance came to Callaway Regional one more time, in the 7th week, in civilian clothes. A plain jacket, no insignia, looking like a man who had driven to Millhaven from somewhere else and was not on official business, which was either true or a reasonable approximation of it. He came to the ED floor during a mid-morning quiet period and found her at the station. I have something for you, he said. He gave her a document. Official letterhead, Army Medical Corps, with a case reference number and a formal language block at the top, that she read once and then had to read again because the first read felt like looking at something that couldn't be real. The Keene Valley Inquiry finding had been formally vacated, not suspended, vacated. The specific language, finding rendered on the basis of materially falsified evidence. Original determination has no standing, record corrected accordingly. Below the language block, a second section, a commendation. For her service in Keene Valley specifically, with the language that commendations used when they were acknowledging things that had happened in conditions that were worse than the conditions people were supposed to operate in. She looked at the document for a long time. There's one more thing, Vance said. It's not in the document, it's a conversation, if you want to have it. She looked up. The division has a civilian medical advisor role, he said. It's not military service, it's consultative, working with Army medical units on field triage protocol, training design, the gap between clinical medicine and operational medicine. He paused. We've been without someone in that role for 2 years. The person before you, the person whose work your unit operated under in Keene Valley, retired, and we haven't found someone who understood both sides of it well enough to be useful. She looked at him. Both sides. What it looks like in a hospital and what it looks like in the field, he said. Most people know one. You know both. And you know what happens when the translation between them breaks down, because you lived it. She stood with that. The offer had a shape she hadn't expected. Not a return to service, not a leaving of the work she was doing, but something that occupied the space between them, connecting the version of her that had existed before October and the version that existed now. I'm not leaving this hospital, she said. The role doesn't require it. It's time-limited engagements, 3 to 5 times a year. You'd keep your position here. He paused. The division wants someone who is actively working in clinical medicine. That's part of the point. She thought about it. The thinking was not long. It had the quality of something she had already half known was coming, the way she sometimes knew a patient's result before the imaging came back. Not because she was certain, but because she had been paying attention to all the right things long enough that the conclusion was already present by the time the data confirmed it. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. He seemed unsurprised. Take your time. He left. She held the document in her hands at the nurse's station for another moment. She was aware of Tanya Osei 2 feet to her left, was aware of the hum of the floor, the ambient monitoring sounds, the ambient life of an emergency department at mid-morning. She was aware of the east entrance with its stiff push bar and its flickering light and the 3 years of side doors she had used because the side door was safer than the one where people could see you arriving. She would still use it. Old habits of navigation did not die just because the reason for them had. But she would use it because she knew the building, because she arrived early, because she was the person who knew which hinge needed a shoulder and which cabinet had the right supplies and which page would pull the fastest response from a specialist. Not because she was trying to take up less space. That was a small distinction and also not a small one. Tanya said without looking up from her chart, "Good news?" Evelyn looked at the document. Then she set it in her bag. "Working on it," she said. The day moved. The ED moved. Bay 3 got a pediatric case that needed a delicate hand with the parents, who were scared and performing calm in the specific way that scared parents performed calm, imperfectly, at the edges. Bay 5 got a man in his 60s with a fall mechanism that looked like a fall and had 3 other things underneath it that a less attentive nurse would not have found until the attending saw the chart. Bay 7 got a young woman who had been waiting 4 hours in the main waiting room and whose presentation had shifted in those 4 hours in a direction that Evelyn flagged to the attending with the specific urgency language that she no longer second-guessed before using. She moved through all of it with the unhurried efficiency that people called calm, and that was not calm exactly. It was attention. Sustained, trained, distributed attention of the kind that looked unremarkable from the outside until the moment when it caught the thing that mattered. At the end of her shift, she stopped at Bay 4 on her way out. Not because a patient was there. It was empty between cases, the gurney freshly papered, the monitor reset. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She was thinking about the man who had been on that gurney in October, and the seconds between the alarm and the needle, and the specific cost of a decision that didn't have time to be anything other than what it was. She thought about what it had taken to make that decision. Not training. Training was the mechanism, not the source. The source was something harder to name. The refusal to let the calculation change based on what the decision would cost her personally. She had known the cost. She had made it anyway. That had always been the thing. It had looked like recklessness to people who didn't know her. It had looked like arrogance, maybe, to Holt, someone acting outside her authority, overriding the room. But it had not been recklessness, and it had not been arrogance. It had been the result of a very clear set of values, held under pressure for a very long time. That said, the patient is the first thing. Not the second thing, not the thing you get to after the paperwork and the protocol and the opinion of the person with more letters after their name. The first thing. 3 years in a building that did not know what she was had not changed that. The inquiry that put her name on a finding she didn't earn had not changed that. The suspension, the badge on the desk, the boardroom with its view of a job she was about to lose, none of it had changed the thing that was underneath. That was not a triumph. It was just a fact about who she was. But facts about who you are, held clearly, were the most stable thing she knew. She turned off the light in Bay 4. She went through the east entrance on her way out. Not the main lobby, not the south exit. The push bar was still stiff. She hit it with her right shoulder. The light in the corridor flickered twice and held. Some things you fixed, some things you learned the shape of and moved through anyway, because the destination was worth the stiff bar and the flickering light, and because knowing the shape of something difficult was itself a kind of competence. She came out into the parking lot. Cold air, October turned to November, the sky already dark at the end of a shift that had started in daylight. Her car was in the third row, where she always parked because the third row meant a clear sight line to both exits and a shorter walk in wet weather. Habits of attention, everywhere. She sat in the car for a moment before starting it. She thought about what Vance had said. The room probably won't know it. That's fine. You know it. That's the one that counts. She thought about whether that was true. She had lived inside that belief for 3 years, that it was enough to know your own worth when no one else was measuring it. And it was true, she thought, to a point. It sustained you. It kept the thing that mattered alive when the institutional record said otherwise. But it was not sufficient on its own, because institutions were made of people, and people needed the truth in front of them in order to respond to it. And when the truth was buried, by falsified records, by purchased inquiry boards, by the deliberate architecture of making someone small enough that their voice didn't carry, the knowing it yourself was the floor, not the ceiling. The ceiling was what happened when the truth got out, when the voices that had been managed into silence became audible again. When the man on the gurney turned out to be the thread that, when pulled, unraveled 3 years of carefully maintained lies. She had not pulled that thread. She had just done her job, the same job she had been doing in a side entrance hospital in a mid-sized Ohio city for 3 years, and the thread had been there, and it had been time. Maybe that was the thing about the quiet ones, she thought, the ones who show up early and know which hinge is broken and fix the medication errors nobody asked them to fix. The world ran on that kind of person. The world would not function for 24 hours without them, and it also, frequently, did not bother to look. But not looking was not the same as being invisible. And the day it mattered, the day the gurney came through the door and the monitor dropped and the room froze, the quiet ones were already in position. They were always already in position. She started the car. She had a letter to respond to, and a conversation to think about, and a shift tomorrow that would start at 5:48 with a right shoulder against a stiff push bar and a light that flickered twice and held. She was not finished. She had not been finished any of the days she had walked into that building with the weight of a false record and a sealed box, and the careful dimensions of a version of herself that fit without touching the edges. She was, for the first time in 3 years, not pretending to be finished. She pulled out of the lot onto the Millhaven Road, into the dark and the cold and the ordinary world that did not yet know, and did not need to know tonight, that the nurse everyone called the librarian had, at the end of a very long day, finally opened the box.